name is Sizakele Maruchile. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the first installment of the Vitality Home series. For this first talk, we'll be joined by panelists who are leaders in their respective fields, but the sum total of their contribution will cover science, aspects of behavior, and conversations with professional athletes who will share from their lived experiences. I will introduce my panelists a little later, so let's just get through some housekeeping. Firstly, please extend the conversation to social media by using the hashtag #VitalityHomeSeries. We will hold a Q&A at the end of the discussion. Please post your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box, and I'm sure you'll see it at the bottom of your screens. This is also being recorded, which means you'll have the benefit of listening to it 1 more or 10 more times with friends and family who were not able to join us today. On the panel today is an esteemed set of human beings, and I'm super delighted to be able to introduce them to you. First one to address us will be Professor Jon Patricios. He is a sports and exercise medicine physician at Wits. He will then be followed by a dialogue between myself, Bruce Fordyce, who's a 9 times Comrades winner, and Wandile Nongodwana, who has run the Comrades 12 times and secured 7 silvers along the way. To round off our discussion will be Dr. Musima Mabunda, who is the head of Vitality Wellness at Discovery. We will get through this in an hour, so please post your questions as we go along. And now we're ready to get started. Over to you, Prof.
Right, can we all see that? Good. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much to Vitality for arranging this, and to the fellow panelists. Lovely to be with you. My brief today is really to talk a little bit about why we should move more and why exercise matters during COVID-19. But as a start, I've decided to rearrange the title, and you'll see why. And that is to discuss Move More, why exercise matters before, during, and after COVID-19. And we'll go through a few slides which demonstrate that. So if you're anything like me, the last few months, your brain has been a little bit like this, and you feel there's corona and COVID all over the place. And hopefully, in the next few minutes, an hour, we can help clear some of that clutter by putting a bit of science behind what's going on in the background. So I'm going to start off by putting the situation at the moment into some context. Now, at WITS, we did a webinar on COVID fairly early in March, and we put this slide up, which showed where COVID was in relation to deaths caused by a number of diseases. Towards the end of April, we put up a similar slide, and corona or COVID-19 was looking something like this in terms of the pecking order. And last week it looked like this. So we can see that in this country and around the world, we really are in the face of a storm. And it's no better time to discuss what we should be doing to try and prevent infections. So this is where South Africa faces itself at the moment as we enter into the second week of July. We're now top of the table in terms of bi-weekly growth rate of coronavirus infections. So we really are at the bottom of a Mount Everest precipice, and we really need to take this very, very seriously in terms of trying to prevent it and protect ourselves. And what I'm going to discuss in the next few slides is how exercise is so important in doing that. I don't want to turn you into virologists tonight, but there are some key issues that we need to understand about this virus. And I'm going to refer to 3 things. One is its structure, how it's made up. The other is infectivity, how good it is at infecting people. And the third aspect is what we call morbidity, or how sick it can potentially make you. So we're talking about this thing here, and you've seen the stylized version countless times by now. Just some terminology. It's called a coronavirus because it fits into this family of viruses that look like crowns. This particular virus is called the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and the disease it causes is called COVID-19. So that's some important terminology. In terms of this virus itself, some important structural issues which I want to address. The first is that it has what we call an RNA genome, which is the genetic material. And this is really what does all the damage. It's what replicates in our cells multiple times, billions and billions of times. But the important thing about this, it requires a living human body to do its damage. Without it being in a living human body, it can't do its work. The second important structural feature is this spike called the glycoprotein, a spike made of sugar and protein. It's not only a spike, but it's a sticky spike. So it sticks to our cell receptors in a very adherent way, and that increases its likelihood of infecting the cells. The third important aspect is what we call this envelope. Now, the envelope in this particular virus is made up of lipid or fat. And the important thing about this is that this lipid or fatty layer is vulnerable to two important things. One is soap and the other is alcohol. And those two things remain our biggest assets in terms of defending ourselves against this virus. And that's very, very important to remember. So a little bit of virology to start. In terms of each of those things, in terms of the infectivity, this is a very interesting slide because it shows us on the x-axis how infective a particular virus is, and then on the vertical axis, actually how severe it is in terms of causing deaths. So if you take some extreme examples like chickenpox, for instance, we all know that if you're exposed to chickenpox and you haven't been exposed before, you will contract chickenpox. It's a very, very infectious virus. But we also know that nobody dies from chickenpox. So it's not a very dangerous virus at all. Sorry, that's just slipped by. At the other end of the spectrum, if you look at Ebola, for instance, Ebola is much less infective than chickenpox, but half the people that contract Ebola will die from it. So the result of that is obviously that it's a very severe disease, but also that it's not transmitted that often because the people generally die from it who suffer from it. Now, the interesting thing about COVID-19 is it sits somewhere in the middle. It's reasonably infective. So if you get exposed, you're likely to contract it, but it doesn't kill that many people. And so it's transmitted from one to another very easily because the people who have it are often not that sick or don't even know they have it sometimes. So it makes it very much more important to defend against, but also very difficult to defend against. So it's an infectious virus, but it's not too deadly. Interestingly, some other interesting aspect, kids don't contract the virus as easily, and that's because they don't have as many of the receptors for the virus to stick to, and they have a slightly immature immune system. They don't transmit the virus as well either. But we do know there are vulnerable groups. We're going to refer to those now. And there's some other interesting aspects which make this disease something that we have to take seriously. We don't have an inbuilt immunity against it. It attacks a very vulnerable area of ours, and that's the respiratory system, the lungs in particular. There's this concept of the cytokine storm, or how the actual virus creates an inflammatory response within our own bodies, which causes its own damage. And it's come at a time when we're in a 21st century lifestyle of hustle and bustle, people who are very close to each other, and that's allowed it to spread very quickly. We also know there's no treatment, there's no vaccine, and it's come to South Africa where we usually have only 3,000 ICU beds available. So even a severe infectious rate of 4 to 5% in a population of 50 million is significant. In terms of the illness itself, we know that most of them are mild. Most of us are not going to have serious illnesses. It'll be a cold or flu-like illness. A percentage are severe and may require hospitalization, and probably up to 4 or 5% will require intensive care, with probably about 1 to 2% dying. We know that the aged are most at risk from worldwide statistics, including in this country. And very importantly, we know that if you have certain medical conditions, you are much more likely to suffer severe COVID-19 disease than if you don't. And those are listed at the bottom here. Now, what's very interesting is the more of these you have, the more likely you are to be sick. So if you have 3 of these conditions, you are 48% increased risk of dying. Now, also interestingly is that those conditions listed at the bottom and on the side here are the conditions that have lower incidences in people who exercise regularly. So the point I want to make here is if you are a regular exerciser, you already have a head start in protecting yourself against COVID-19 because you are less likely to have heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, stroke, cancer, or dementia. And that's a very important take-home message. In that come the next crisis that we face, we should be protecting ourselves by exercising regularly. I want to talk a little bit about our immune response because this is all our body has to fight this condition. And again, we're going to talk a little bit about how our body does this in terms of what we call immunology. So there are really two stages to this. The first is what we call an innate immune system. It's the cells we have waiting for any sort of virus or what we call a pathogen to come into our bodies. And don't worry about some of the terminology here, but look at the pictures and literally what these cells do, they lie in wait for anything that they recognize as foreign to the body, and they effectively chew them up and get rid of them. And that's really the sort of lying in waiting immune system which we have. And one of the things that exercise does is it circulates these cells more. So it makes them more effective in terms of mopping up the viruses as they come into our body. When the body is exposed to the virus, it realizes often that it's a bit overwhelmed. So it sends out these messenger cells or chemicals known as cytokines or chemokines, which result in a whole lot of more cells coming to the rescue, as it were. And that creates that inflammatory response, which in itself can be quite unpleasant to deal with. And then there's a second tier of the immune system called the adaptive immune system. Now, it's adaptive because it adapts specifically to that virus or pathogen. And it takes a few days for this to kick in because it has to recognize the pathogen or the virus, and it has to specifically create proteins which kill the pathogen or antibodies which kill the pathogen. So that's the second tier of our immune response. And this also is improved in terms of efficacy by regular exercise. So we now have an immune system which is lying in waiting, and we have an adaptive immune system which is specific, which recognizes the body's own cells so it doesn't attack those, and which has a memory. So it leaves us with some immunity for some time to come so that we're protected against that pathogen in future weeks and months. And as I've mentioned, exercise does a good job of upgrading this immune response. It flushes out bacteria and pathogens. It increases your antibody levels. It improves the circulation of the cells that fight infection. Exercise also causes a brief rise in temperature, which is less hospitable for the viruses, and it causes a lower release of stress hormones, which actually counter immunity if they're in too high a level. So exercise is really a very good way of maintaining your immune system. We've known for many years that exercise is very useful in many aspects. So if we look at its effect on life and on the body, it improves your cognitive function. We know that kids who exercise do better at maths, for instance. We know that adults who exercise have lower levels of dementia. It improves your sociability and your social skills. It improves your emotional well-being. You have lower incidences of depression and anxiety. And we've known for years, as I mentioned, that those non-communicable diseases, the hypertension, the heart diseases, the diabetes, have much lower incidence in people that exercise. But one thing that we've always underestimated is the effect on immunity. And we need to start recognizing the number of ways in which regular exercise can impact positively on the immune system. So if we look at these, the exchange of those cells that fight infection, the cumulative effect the more times you exercise, a 40 to 50% decrease in upper respiratory tract infections, a lower death rate from flu and pneumonia, an enhanced response to vaccinations, and what we call delayed immunosenescence, which is the aging effect of the immune system. So as you get older, your immune system becomes less effective. If you exercise regularly, that doesn't happen as quickly. And then finally, very significantly, the response of the immune system is actually best in people who are obese, hypertensive, diabetic, and have cardiac disease. So if we look at all of those, importantly, those are the criteria which will determine a bad outcome from COVID-19. And that's exactly the cohort, the group that exercise targets best. And there's very good literature that summarizes this. And so there's very good science that supports this. And to the extent that when the government introduced a very strict lockdown, a group of us from WITS actually wrote an open letter to them based on science, summarizing the science to say, please, let's use exercise to actually fight this thing and not actually limit the amount that people are exercising, because all we've got available to us is hygiene and exercise to fight this. And so we made a plea to open up public spaces in a controlled way, allow for more exercise time, reintroduce physically distanced sports, encourage school children to exercise in a responsible way, and then gradually, as the situation allowed, reintroduce team sports. So, because we've been in a period of lockdown or restricted activity, we've had to learn to exercise at home and work. What are the guidelines in terms of exercise? And if you look up what are the guidelines for exercise, you'll often see 3 to 5 times a week, exercise on most days, and exercise for about 30 minutes at a time. I want to really stress that I think that's a bare minimum recommendation. I think we should be exercising every day. We could often be exercising more than once a day, formally or informally, particularly in a lockdown situation. We need variety in our exercise in terms of cardiovascular load, strength, stretching, etc. And we need to vary the intensity, and we'll get to that in the question session because there's a lot to be said about exercising intensity and whether that's good or bad. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then very importantly, we need to start using technology better. We need to use technology for training. And I think we've all become accustomed to those sort of apps and the Zoom classes, etc. But importantly, what technology is going to allow us to do and allow insurers to do in particular is track our exercise patterns using artificial intelligence and digital applications. Because of the hard data we now have that shows how effective it is to exercise in fighting these conditions, we will be encouraged to exercise and rewarded for exercising as a result of technology becoming involved in our exercise and monitoring of exercise. When it comes to the exercising and exercising safely, very important to, in this environment, exercise very safely. So that means on your own often, outside rather than inside. Increase your physical distancing from 1 to 2 meters to 4 to 6 meters. Clean your hands before and after. Clean equipment before and after. And then address the issue of wearing masks. And there's unfortunately some confusing messaging going out about masks. The World Health Organization put this out saying you shouldn't wear masks when exercising. I think it's misleading exercise information, and I would rather we listened to this sort of information which was put out by a South African group actually that gave much more pragmatic advice in terms of wearing masks with exercise. And the take-home message is wear a mask whenever you can. And if you can't wear a mask because of breathing discomfort, make sure you're exercising far away from other people and outdoors. Very important information about exercising if you have contracted COVID-19. The guidelines are the following. You should be asymptomatic, have no symptomatic symptoms, and wait a further 10 days after your last symptoms were experienced before you resume a graduated exercise program. In other words, start with low intensity and build up. And if you're in any doubt, you should seek a doctor's clearance, and she or he will put an emphasis on examination of your heart and lungs before clearing you. So to wrap things up and allow the more important speakers to go on after me, very important, exercise is important in all people, in all situations and at all times, but particularly when we're faced with medical crises, and particularly those people that are most vulnerable to that medical crisis. Those are the people who will benefit most from exercise. We underestimate many of the effects of exercise, but we've always underestimated the effects on the immune system. And that's something that now makes us recognize that exercise not only protects us against non-communicable diseases, but communicable diseases as well. Where there's a virus or pathogen involved, if you're a regular exerciser, exercise is going to protect you. And so we need to be facilitating exercise and sport responsibly in whatever environment we are. And those are the take-home messages that I'd like to leave you with today. Move more, exercise matters before, during, and after COVID-19. So thanks very much for your attention. I look forward to the other speakers, and then most importantly, I look forward to engaging with you in the question and answer session. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Prof. This was really sobering yet empowering, and the questions have started flowing in, so there'll be a lot of discussion afterwards. If there are any key takeouts for me, the one is the idea that exercise matters all the time, not on the day that has a Y in it. It's like every day indeed. It improves our immune response and emotional well-being and sociability. If you exercise consistently, you are least likely to have those underlying conditions that increase your risk with COVID-19. The Prof also said that soap and alcohol, I don't think he meant alcohol, Puza, I think he meant alcohol sanitizer, with masks as well as physical distancing. Those are still our best defenses under the current climate.